Hey everyone, and welcome back to class. This week we're talking about Moore's proof of an external world. So last week we talked about skepticism and arguments for why we should be external world skeptics. This week we're talking about a proof of the external world. So it's a response to skeptics trying to show that we should not be external world skeptics. And it's Thanksgiving week, so I'm going to try to keep this video short. And if you have any questions, let me know because we won't be moving quite as slowly as we sometimes do. So, plan for today, we're going to go through Moore's proof, which is actually very short. It's an incredibly short proof. Then we're going to ask whether or not it actually is a proof, because that's most of what Moore does in his paper. He tries to argue that it really is a proof. And then we're going to ask whether or not it's convincing. So, Moore's proof. Moore's trying to prove that there is an external world. Immanuel Kant, who you may remember from Kantianism, the version of ethics that said you have to obey the categorical imperative, which is that you have to treat people as ends in themselves, not as a mere means, you can never lie, etc., etc. That Kant, same Kant, said it was a great scandal to philosophy that we can't prove that there's an external world. Kant was convinced by the sort of skeptical arguments that we talked about last week, the dreaming argument, brain in a vat, evil demon, etc. Kant thought we can't prove that there's an external world. We can't know for sure that there is a world outside of our own minds. He said it has to be accepted merely on faith, that anything exists outside of us. And Kant tried to provide a proof, but failed. Kant thought there had not existed a proof. He tried to provide one, and Moore, and pretty much everyone else after Kant, thinks Kant's proof failed. So Moore wants to step in and fill that void. He wants to provide a proof of the external world, a response to the skeptical arguments we talked about last week. So here's Moore's proof of an external world. And he does it by trying to prove that there are external objects. Namely, that there are objects that exist outside of your own mind. Remember, we talked last week about what external objects are in the external world. So he's going to try to prove that there are external objects, the kinds of external objects that we believe there are, and thus prove that there is an external world, and thus show that we do and can, in fact, have knowledge of the external world. So here's his proof. 1, here is a hand. 2, here is another. 3, therefore, there are at least 2 hands. And therefore, there are at least 2 external objects. End of proof. Or no, sorry. Therefore, there is an external world. Okay, now end of proof. All right, so that's his proof. It's very simple. Here's a hand. Here's another. Therefore, there are at least 2 hands. Therefore, there are at least 2 external objects. And therefore, there is an external world. And that argument's certainly valid, right? Because here's a hand, here's another. Hands, if they exist outside of your mind. So they are external objects. So if there are at least 2 hands, then there are at least 2 external objects. That's perfectly good inference. And if there are external objects, well, then there's an external world. The external world is just everything external to your mind. So if external objects exist, if there are objects that exist outside your mind, well, then there's an external world. So that's also a good inference. And of course, here's a hand, here's another. The inference from that to there are at least 2 hands, perfectly solid. So it's a valid argument, Moore's proof. The question is whether or not it's a proof. So here's the paragraph where Moore really gives the proof in the reading, where he says, I can give a large number of different proofs, each of which is perfectly rigorous. I can prove that 2 human hands exist. How? By holding up my 2 hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is 1 hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, here is another. And if by doing this, I have proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you all see that I can now do it in numbers of other ways. So he says, look, I've proved that I have hands, but I can use this same structure To prove lots of things. I can prove there are tables. I can prove that my family exists. I can prove my friends exist. I can prove my bookshelf exists. I can just point and say, here's a bookshelf. Therefore, there are bookshelves. Done. So Moore thinks all the skeptical arguments that showed we don't know that our friends and family exist, we don't know that we have hands, we don't know that our bookshelves and tables and chairs exist, all those arguments were wrong. Because we can prove that bookshelves exist. We can prove our hands exist. We can prove our friends and family exist, which is a good thing to do right before Thanksgiving. And he thinks that he has proved it by saying, here's a hand, here's another, therefore there are at least two hands. He thinks he has proved the existence of hands. So, has he? Well, he thinks, yeah, of course he thinks that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said it. But he thinks that this is a proof. A perfectly rigorous proof was the phrase he used. So if we want to ask whether or not it's a proof, we need to ask what a proof is. And a proof is an argument that proves that its conclusion is true, right? That's simple. A proof is just a kind of argument. It's an argument that proves the conclusion. That's trivial. Of course, a proof proves. That's just what the word proof means. But what does it mean to prove that something is true? That's the question. So to prove that something is true, you have to show that it's definitely true, beyond a doubt. To prove something, you have to remove all doubt about it. You have to remove any doubt that it might not be true. You have to show that it is definitely, definitively, unquestionably true. Right? That's what mathematical proofs do. When you have a rigorous mathematical proof, then you know for certain, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the conclusion is true. Assuming that you know enough math to follow it. Like I can't follow the proof of Fermat's last theorem, for example, but mathematicians who can say it shows beyond all doubt that the theorem is true. Right. So that's what proofs are supposed to do. Show the conclusion can't possibly be false. And so a proof of the external world needs to demonstrate beyond a doubt that there is an external world. And Moore thinks that his argument does that. He thinks his argument counts as a proof. And it counts as a proof because it satisfies three conditions. And Moore says that any argument that satisfies these three conditions is a proof. And he says his argument satisfies them, and therefore is a proof. So what are these conditions? These conditions that make an argument a proof? Well, one, the premise must be different than the conclusion of the proof, right? The argument can't be circular. You can't say, like, I'm right, therefore I'm right. Or I'm never wrong, therefore I'm not wrong. The premise has to really be different than the conclusion. You have to really be saying different things. Circular arguments aren't proofs. Arguments that beg the question aren't proofs. So, for example, there is an external world, therefore there is an external world would not be a proof. That's a circular argument. The premise and the conclusion just are the same thing. You haven't proved anything there. So that wouldn't be a proof. So in order for an argument to be a proof, the premise must be different than the conclusion. And now Moore's first condition is met by his argument. But it's really just a sort of rule against circular arguments. The second condition is that the premise is something that you know to be true, rather than something you just believe or aren't certain of, or something that happens to be true but you don't know is true. Right? You can't just say brains in vats are impossible, therefore I'm not a brain in a vat. Or I'm awake, therefore the world around me is exactly as I think it is. Because if we don't really know that brains in vats are impossible, then we can still doubt that premise. And we don't know. So we have to know the premises. If we don't know that the premises are true, if there's some doubt about whether or not the premises are true, then you can still doubt the conclusion, right? An argument's only as good as the premises. If you aren't sure that the premises are true, then no matter how well argued the argument is, you you can't be completely certain of the conclusion, right? If you start with crap, you end up with crap, even in a valid argument. If your argument is valid, but your premises, who knows whether or not they're true, then the conclusion, well, who knows whether or not it's true. You need to know the premises for sure in order to know that the conclusion is true. Remember, premises are the starting point of an argument. So if you start out with doubts, you're going to end up with doubts. So you have to start your argument with things you know are true, things that definitely are true. Because that's the only way that you can prove the conclusion is true. The only way that you can get to the conclusion and have no doubts in the conclusion and prove that the conclusion is true beyond a doubt. You need the premises to be things you know are true. There can't be any room for doubt. That's the second condition. And Moore's third condition is that the conclusion really does follow from the premises. Right? You can't just say, well, 2 plus 2 equals 4, therefore there is an external world. That's an argument. And you know that the premise is true, so it meets the second condition. And the premise is different than the conclusion, so it meets the first condition. So 2 plus 2 equals 4, therefore there is an external world, satisfies conditions 1 and 2. But it's still not a proof, right? That's should clearly not be a proof. It doesn't prove anything. And the reason it doesn't prove anything is that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. The premise and the conclusion are totally unrelated. The premise could be true even if the conclusion weren't. Even if there were no external world, 2 plus 2 would still equal 4. So even if you were a brain in a vat, 2 plus 2 would still equal 4. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. And so the third condition is really just the condition that the argument has to be valid. So another way of phrasing the conditions is that 1, the argument can't be circular. 2, you have to know that the premises are true. And 3, the argument has to be valid. And Moore thinks those 3 conditions mean that the argument is a proof. If an argument meets those 3 conditions, if it's not circular, you know the premises, and it's valid, then it is a proof. And you now have proved the conclusion. So maybe you think those are the right conditions for a proof. Maybe they're not. Maybe you don't think that. But let's suppose they're right. Does Moore's argument actually satisfy those conditions? Does Moore's argument count as a proof? Well, Moore argues yes. Moore argues that his proof satisfies all 3 conditions. So premise or condition 1, the premise must be different than the conclusion. Moore thinks that is satisfied by his argument. His argument meets that condition because here is a hand is a very different claim than there is an external world, right? Those do not mean the same thing. You may have said that your hand is up or here's a hand at some point and have never heard the phrase external world. Like they just mean different things. Here's a hand and there's an external world are not the same thing. So the argument is not circular, right? Here is a hand has a different meaning than there's an external world. There could be an external world even if you didn't have a hand here. So they can't mean the same thing because one could be true while the other was false. Maybe there's no hand here. There would still be an external world even if you didn't have hands. So when you say here's a hand, you mean something different than when you say there's an external world. So this argument is not circular. The premise really does say something different than the conclusion. So the first condition is met for Moore's proof. Now, second condition. The premise is something that you know to be true rather than something you simply believe but aren't certain of, or something that happens to be true but you don't know is true. So this is where the real sort of meat of the argument is. This is where the real force is. It's more trying to show that you do know for a fact, here is a hand, that you know that to be true. And Moore says, you do know that here is a hand. You know that to be true. Hold up your own hand, say, here is a hand. Moore thinks you know that what you just said is true. And you know that as much as you could possibly know anything. Okay. Here is a hand is what a philosopher named David Lewis called a Moorean fact, named after G.E. Moore, who wrote this proof. He said it's one of those things that we know better than we know the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary. Meaning, you know that you have hands with more certainty than you know that the brain in a vat argument is sound. You know this with more certainty than you know the claim that it's logically possible that there's an evil demon deceiving you. You know that you have hands with more certainty than you know that you have no evidence that you're not dreaming. Like all that sort of highfalutin philosophical mumbo jumbo about what's logically possible and what's conceivable and whether or not you could be a brain in a vat and all that stuff is fine. And you might be confident in it. But are you as confident in all of those claims and all of those skeptical arguments as you are in the fact that you have hands in front of your face when you hold up your hands? Moore and David Lewis say, no. You should be much more certain that you have hands in front of you than you could ever possibly be that you could possibly be a brain in a vat. And if you were a brain in a vat, you would have all the same evidence. And therefore, that means that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat. And therefore, that means that you don't know anything about the external world. Like all of that high concept philosophy stuff is not nearly as certainly true as the fact that you have hands in front of you. You should be way more confident that you have hands in front of you than you should be that brains and vats are logically possible, right? That's what Moore thinks here. And so Moore says, you know that you have hands and your senses give you direct evidence and you just know that it's true. So a Moorean fact is something that you know is true and you know with more certainty than any argument to the contrary could give you. So if you need to ask yourself, what are you more sure of? That you have hands or that the skeptical arguments are completely flawless and error-free? That there's no mistake anywhere in the argument? That it's a perfectly sound argument? Are you more confident that the skeptical arguments are sound or that you have hands? Because they can't both be true. So you have to decide which one you're more confident in. And Moore thinks the right answer is that you should be more sure that you have hands. You should be much more confident that you have hands than you are of anything involving the skeptical arguments. You should be more sure of the claim that you have hands than you are of the claim that it's possible to be a brain in a vat. And therefore, Moore thinks we should conclude that we do know that we have hands. So we do know the premises of his argument. We know that the premises, here is a hand, here is another, are true. And if we know that those premises are true, if we know here is a hand, here's another, if we know there are hands here in front of us, then the second condition for a proof is met. We do know the premises of the argument. Now, third condition. The conclusion really does follow from the premises. Basically, is the argument valid? Well, hands really are external objects. So if there really are hands, then there really are external objects. That step is valid. And if there really are external objects, then there really is an external world. The external world is just everything that exists outside of our minds, out of our mind. So if there are external objects, meaning if there are objects that exist outside of our minds, then there is stuff that exists outside of our minds. And so there's an external world. So that step is valid. So if that hand is really there, then it exists out in the world. It's not an idea or a mental object or a feeling. It's a physical thing with weight and mass, uh, gravitational pull, yada, yada. It's a physical thing that exists outside of our minds. And so if there's a hand there, if there really is a hand here, then there must be an external world in which that hand exists. So there must be an external world. So the argument really is valid. The conclusion really does follow from the premises. The hand is by definition an external thing. And so the conclusion that there is an external world really does follow from here's a hand, here's another. And those are the premises. So the argument really is valid. The conclusion really does follow from the premises. And so Moore's third condition is met. And so Moore thinks that this is a proof. He has proved that there is an external world. Because we know, he says that the premises are different than the conclusion. We know the premises to be true. And the conclusion really does follow from the premises. And he says his argument meets those three conditions, and any argument meeting those conditions is a proof. So he says this is a proof. Now, is the proof convincing? Well, a lot of people say no. And Moore thinks that one reason people say no is that they want him to prove things that he hasn't proved or even tried to prove. He thinks they want him to prove here is a hand. They want him to prove the premises of the proof. And Moore does not provide a proof of the premise, here is a hand. And he doesn't think it's possible to provide a proof. He said, if this is what is meant by proof of the existence of external things, I do not believe that any proof of the existence of external things is possible. So Moore thinks you cannot prove here is a hand. So his premises, while we know them to be true, according to Moore at least, we cannot prove that they are true. And some people think that by acknowledging that he can't prove his premises, he's giving up. Moore's giving up on proving that there is an external world. But Moore doesn't think he's giving up. Moore says, how am I to prove now here's a hand and here's another? I can't do it. In order to do it, I need to prove that I am not now dreaming. But how can I prove that? He says, and this is the key, which I have in bold here on the slide, I have, no doubt, conclusive reasons for asserting that I am not now dreaming. I have conclusive evidence that I am awake. But that is a very different thing from being able to prove it. I could not tell you what all my evidence is, and I should require to do this, at least, in order to give you a proof. So Moore says, in order to prove here is a hand, here's another, he would have to give all of his evidence that he's awake. But he can't give all of his evidence. He thinks he has that evidence. He has conclusive evidence that he's awake. But he couldn't even begin to say what all of that evidence is. And he thinks we're all in that same boat. So he says he can't prove his premises that he has hands. But he still has conclusive evidence that he has hands. You look and you see, here's a hand, and you should be as confident of that as you are of anything in life. And he thinks that's enough to use here's a hand and here's another in his proof. His final point here, and this is the key point Moore tries to make, I think, is that you can know something without being able to prove it. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't hold out for proof all the time, or at least sometimes. In a court of law, we should definitely wait for proof of guilt before we punish people for crimes. The prosecutor should have to prove that someone committed murder before we throw them in jail for murder. proof is very good there. Math, we should definitely wait for mathematical proofs. If someone makes an unbelievably outrageous claim, you should probably ask them to prove it before you start reevaluating everything in your life because of the claim they made. Now, whether that's a claim about your personal life or like mole people are running the government from an underground layer, whatever it is, probably ask for proof before you start believing them. But some things, right, don't require proof. More things. The fact that you have hands in front of you doesn't require proof. More things, the existence of moral truths doesn't require proof, even though we can know that there are moral facts, that some things are morally wrong. He thinks we can know that, even though we can't prove that. So Moore thinks there are things that we can know without proving. So the fact that we don't have a proof that we have hands doesn't show that we can't know that we have hands. The absence of a proof is not itself a proof that we don't have knowledge. So even if we can't prove that we have hands, we can still know that we have hands, according to G.E. Moore. And that's Moore's argument. All right. And so that's all I wanted to talk about this week. There's no weekly assignment this week. If you have any questions about this material, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.